Hello, my name is Vanessa Johnson. I am doing a presentation for my Political Science 1030 American Government, Professor Christopher Whaley. I chose to do my assignment on civil rights, focusing on women's rights specifically. The reason that I chose this particular topic is one of my all-time favorite movies is actually A League of Their Own, which is based around the time periods of like World War II when all of the men were sent overseas, obviously, to fight our war, and the women were left to take care of the family, raise the family, make the money for the family, provide for the family. They had to go to work. Women that were housewives and have been housewives their whole life and raised to be nothing more than a housewife was forced to have to work to provide for her family because her husband was gone overseas. So, that movie having a great deal of an impact on my life and showing me that those rights are very important, I thought that I would choose this for my topic. Women's rights prior to the 1840s, there was none. It was non-existent. We didn't have rights outside of our husbands. Our husbands were considered to be the head of the household. They were the providers for the family. So when it came time for things such as voting, their vote counted for the whole household. When it came to property, if a woman had a piece of property prior to her marriage, once she was married, that property became her husband's. There was no argument about it. If the husband chose to sell that property, he sold it, whether she agreed or not, because she had no rights. She had no property rights. She had no rights outside of the marriage. So, the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca, New York in 1848. It was held by some very prominent women in the women's rights or women's movements of the time period, Miss Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia Mott. They were very, very well-known activists. They created, Miss Stanton wrote a declaration that was based off of the Declaration of Independence called the Declaration of Sentiments. It was a declaration that was looking for rights for civil, social, and political and religious rights for women. That was their ultimate goal, was to create as much equality for women as they possibly could. That was the first meeting. There was another meeting held in 1850. But at that first meeting, there were over 300 people in attendance, which was a fairly big deal for that being their very first meeting. There was actually over 100 people that signed the Declaration of Sentiments. Most of them, the majority, were women, but there were several men, 30-plus men, that did sign the Declaration as well. And then they had a second meeting in 1850. This was the beginning of a series of several meetings, of annual meetings, that happened over the next 10 years regularly. After that meeting, there were, like I said, one every 10 years until the 10th meeting, and then there was a few years in between the 11th and then a few years in between the 12th meeting. That 12th meeting occurred in 1869. At that meeting was actually when the National Women's Suffrage Association was really created and brought into play. They were still fighting for the rights of the civil and social and political standpoint, as well as religious rights for women. This was basically the standpoint throughout the entire movement. This movement went on for 70-plus years. In 1890, there were two associations by that point in time that had formed. You had the National Women's Suffrage Association, and then you had the American Women's Suffrage Association. So those two organizations tried to form together. They merged together to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They were a very key player in the the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which actually didn't occur until 1920. The ratification of the 19th Amendment states that no one shall be denied the right to vote based on sex. This was a huge deal for women's rights. This was like, for lack of a better term, the first big accomplishment in a long struggle. And it just seemed to progress and get better from there. We started to gain more and more rights. In 1921, we gained the ability to, actually, we didn't gain the ability, I'm sorry. In 1921, we actually had the creation of the American Birth Control League, which was created by Margaret Sanger, and her goal was to educate women on pregnancy prevention, which was a major deal because obviously the religious standpoints in that time period, there was no sex outside of a marriage, and the whole point of a marriage union was to have children and to continue on your lineage. And the idea that someone might want to not have children right off in that marriage or not jump straight into that was just simply unheard of. So this was a very big battle for women, and it wasn't until actually 1923 that the first actual legal birth control clinic was opened. Now, that clinic wasn't, geared just towards birth control. It was geared towards education, educating women and their husbands on what fertility rights they had, whether or their family planning rights. It was counseling, how the woman's body worked, just simple things of that nature. And then it also introduced them into contraceptive options. It wasn't until 1960 that the Food and Drug Administration approved the birth control pill. Now, that was a big thanks to that American Birth Control League, which actually later became known as the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, which we still know and hear a great deal about today. From after the 1960s, you had President Kennedy entered in some very big things for women's rights. He had a commission on the status of women where he actually appointed Eleanor Roosevelt as his chairwoman. They were very much geared towards ensuring that women were treated equally for men, that women were receiving fair pay in the jobs that they were doing, making sure that their liberties weren't being taken just simply because they were female. He also passed in 1963 the Equal Pay Act, which guaranteed women were being paid by the job, no matter what the sex was. You were being paid for the work done. You couldn't be discriminated by just simply by the fact that you were female and not a man. And that was a very, very big thing because it's actually something that women still seem to think is going on today and is constantly being battled and fought within corporations and companies. You will hear regularly about people stating that they don't get paid as much as their male subsidiaries or their male counterparts. And which is a very tragic thing because there's no need in that. In 1970, you had the Equal Rights Amendment was actually passed through Congress. Unfortunately, it still fell 3 states shy of actual amendment ratification. It is something that is still ongoing. It is still brought up in every regular congressional meeting, and has still yet to be passed. And it is something that really, really needs to be looked at. That would be a great steps in the continuing direction of women's rights. Granted, the rights are considerably better than they were in the 1940s. The 1980s didn't really hold as many major things for women's rights, but we did have things such as Emily's List. There was a Supreme Court ruling that sexual discrimination was an illegal form of, or sexual harassment was an illegal form of job discrimination. There were huge leaps and bounds made in the Violence Against Women's Act. It definitely is reflecting the reflecting the changes that we've had over the years in women's suffrage. So, as I've stated, women's rights are a very key and important role in society, especially with the way the world is today. If women didn't have the rights that we have, there are many families that would not be able to be supportive. There would be many more families found in poverty situations, because there are so many households, such as my own, that are single moms that have children to supply for. And without the ability for me to continue my education, which I was granted through these women's rights movements, or my ability to work full time and take care of and care for my son, I would have no way to provide for him. So these rights are a huge, huge thing for women. I very much enjoyed this presentation. It was very, very informative. I hope that my bombardment of information isn't too much of an overload, and I do hope that you were able to take something from it. So I greatly appreciate your time, and this class has been a very eye-opening experience for someone that had very little to no knowledge in any aspect of American government. It was something I kind of steered clear from. So again, I thank you for your time.